Governor Greg Abbott answering to the people he represents, taking questions on the issues that matter to Texans.
Even though we may have differing opinions on the Second Amendment, we need to find something that works for both sides.
Revealing where he plans to lead Texas in the future.
There are so many levers that the governor has available to him that we're going to be able to begin executing right now.
Now, analysis and impact as we take an in-depth look at the town hall with the governor.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for this special edition of State of Texas. I'm Josh Hinkle, and we're taking an in-depth look at Governor Abbott's town hall in Tyler. From education to taxes to border security, he took on the issues facing people across the state. Governor Abbott took several questions on gun policy. After the deadly mass shooting in El Paso, he vowed to take action to prevent future tragedies. Here's what he had to say during the town hall.
And I want everybody to know that we have to address head-on the shooting that took place in El Paso and make sure that travesties like that never happen again in El Paso or any place in the entire state of Texas. There's going to be multiple steps we take to achieve this goal. First is with this domestic terrorism task force that will be operating year-round, working on these challenges. In addition to that, I will be announcing next week the same process that we used in the aftermath of the shooting at the school in Santa Fe. We had 3 days of roundtables. We will have roundtables, or it may have another name to it, where we will be including all of the delegation of El Paso, as well as other leaders from across the state of Texas, where we will put every issue on the table. But remember this, government doesn't require the legislature to be in session in order for it to work. There are so many levers that the governor has available to him that we're going to be able to begin executing right now for us to be able to make sure that El Paso and other communities are safer right now. And so we are not hesitating whatsoever. It doesn't require a special session for Texas to act, because we will act without a special session, but we will also be working between now and the next session to make sure we have the laws in place to keep El Paso safe and to keep Texas safe.
Texas Congressman Joaquin Castro gave the Democratic response to the governor's town hall. The congressman joins us now live in our studio. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So you said in your response that Texans cannot wait until 2021 for action on gun control. What do you think the governor should do that he is not doing?
Well, first, I'm glad that the governor took time to go to Tyler and have a town hall. I'm surprised that it's the first time that he's done it as governor, because he's been governor for about 5 years now, but I'm glad that he was there. Unfortunately, when it comes to keeping people safe, I didn't hear many solutions. I heard a lot of words. But to answer your question very directly, what he should do. First, we're still in a period of mourning. Literally, the funerals in El Paso are still going on. So I think you have to give Texas a time to heal. But immediately after that, the governor has to do several things. He's got to call the legislature into session to pass universal background checks, to pass red flag laws, to address issues of mental health, because oftentimes this choice is pitted as a choice between addressing gun violence or addressing mental health issues. I think that oftentimes it's actually both. Unfortunately, after the shooting in Santa Fe, there were roundtables. After the shooting in Sutherland Springs, there were roundtables. After the shooting in El Paso, there have been roundtables. So far, we've seen a lot of talk and not much action.
A lot of the talk around guns, many people believe should come from Washington, from Congress specifically, and the fact that he's talking about some substantial items to take steps to do something, a lot of people feel like that's more than what Congress is doing.
Look, listen, I think that the solutions should come from everywhere. I think they should come from Washington where they can. They should come from the Texas legislature. But certainly as Texans, we shouldn't be waiting on Washington to do anything. We have the power here, and I served in the state legislature for 10 years. We have the power, and Governor Abbott has the power to change things and to make Texans safer. So far, there's been a lot of talk. There hasn't been much action.
There has been talk from his office about this being domestic terrorism, talking about white supremacy, a lot of talk about race, specifically related to this. Is it enough?
Well, you're right, because there's two issues here in El Paso. There was the issue of a man who was a racist who was fueled by white supremacist ideology. A lot of that, unfortunately, stoked by our president. And then the second thing is he had a weapon of war that enabled him to carry out this carnage. So you can't just address one of those issues. I'm glad that our state's leaders are finally talking about a very important issue, which is domestic terrorism, and more specifically, white supremacist domestic terrorism. But again, the proof is in the pudding. What is the governor actually going to do about it besides broach the subject? He's got to take action. And if he doesn't actually do anything, the words are worth nothing.
So much of what we've been talking about also deals with immigration and border security specifically. That was one of the big topics at the town hall tonight. Here's how the governor responded to a question about border enforcement.
Remember, the people coming across the border aren't just people looking for a better place to live or looking for a place to work. There are drug cartels involved in this. There are gangs. There are human traffickers. And it's the job of the Department of Public Safety, if there's anybody who's coming across the border committing crimes in the state of Texas, we want those people arrested and put behind bars.
We heard the governor. What do you think about his strategy for the border?
Well, the first thing is, if people are committing crimes, I couldn't agree more. If somebody's engaging in drug trafficking, sex trafficking, human trafficking, which is a big problem in Texas, I agree absolutely. But most of the people who are coming to the U.S.-Mexico border at Texas are seeking asylum in the United States. They're desperate people who are fleeing violent situations in their countries. So they're not coming here to commit crimes. The problem we have is that our state's leaders, what they do is they paint everybody with the same brush. They paint everybody as an MS-13 gang member. And unfortunately, that's what creates a toxic environment. That's what creates the idea that these folks are invading Texas, and it's not healthy for the state.
Congressman Joaquin Castro, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
The governor touted his success on property tax reform in the legislative session, but one Texan at tonight's town hall still had concerns. Listen.
As a Smith County property owner, taxes are very important to me, paying them. This last legislative session, what did you and the other lawmakers do to lower our property taxes?
We did these three things. One, we used more than $5 billion to reduce your property tax rates. On average, across the state of Texas, that will be about a 7% reduction in the first year, with an increased reduction in the second year. In addition to that, know this, because what I'm about to tell you is the biggest effort ever in the state of Texas to limit the growth of government. It involves limiting the ability of those taxing authorities to come back in behind our tax decrease and jack up those property taxes again.
Well, we want to take a deeper dive into the governor's ideas on property taxes, and particularly we want to get insight into what Texans think. So we're bringing in Joshua Blank. He's the research director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas. Welcome.
Thanks.
So the governor, he had helped lead this push for reforms on property taxes and school funding. Is that really what voters think about him? Do they see, him as the face behind that?
I think so. I mean, I think one of the advantages that the governor has from his position is the ability to take credit for the things that he wants to take credit for and pass blame on to the legislature for things that don't get accomplished. And so I think he is the face of sort of property tax reform, and to some extent the education reforms, more so probably than anybody else that we can really think of. Having said that, property tax reform is a tough thing to sell to voters, right? Because even if we reduce the rates at which property tax increases, property values continue to go up. And so generally, it's a little bit of a tricky game to play to take credit for property tax reductions that sometimes Texans aren't really going to notice or feel.
We were talking about red flag laws. Gun policy was a big part of what the conversation was tonight. How do Texans land on this issue?
Well, overall, Texans are actually pretty supportive of red flag laws. So when we asked about this in the February University of Texas Tribune poll, 72% of registered voters in Texas said they support red flag laws, and that included 88% of Democrats and 60% of Republicans. So, this is like a lot of policy areas where when we talk about it in general terms, we see everybody move into their camp and be pretty extreme, but when we start to talk about specific policies, and especially a policy that was originally being sold by the governor himself, who should have a lot of credibility on this issue, that at least until it got into the legislative process, there were actually Republicans, a lot of Republicans who said, yeah, okay, if somebody's dangerous, we should be able to take a gun from them, right?
Joshua Blank, thank you. It's all about perspective.
I think you saw an impassioned governor who loves this state, who believes in the exceptionalism that's happening here.
Different views on the governor's words.
When asked the question about Donald Trump and whether or not to tone down the rhetoric, the governor immediately escapes and decides not to say anything.
Perspective from the left and the right. Next on State of Texas. We want to get some perspective from both the right and the left. Joining us is Manny Garcia, Executive Director of the Texas Democratic Party, and Don Buckingham, a Republican state senator from Lakeway. Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for being here. Senator, we'll start with you. What is your take on tonight's town hall? How'd it go?
I thought Abbott did great. And I can sum it up in 2 words, and that's Texas exceptionalism. You know, we prioritized education. We're giving people a break on property taxes. We're coming up with a measured approach, bipartisan ways to address the big issues in the state. I just thought he knocked it out of the park and did a great job.
And you? What do you think?
I think once again, we saw the governor not deliver any real solutions, say a lot of talk, and dodge the questions. And just critically, right now we're at a moment where we need to be talking about how we get rid of white supremacy and how we combat it. And when asked the question about Donald Trump and whether or not to tone down the rhetoric, the governor immediately escapes and decides not to say anything.
Well, he did call for a domestic terror task force. Is that not enough right now?
We've looked at the composition of the domestic terrorism task force. It doesn't have experts in white supremacy, doesn't have anybody representing the Southern Poverty Law Center, the NAACP, LULAC, MALDAF, the Human Rights Campaign, folks that deal with hate on a daily basis. What you see is a lot of bureaucrats. You see a lot of Republicans. You see Dan Patrick, the same kind of person who used this language in 2014, long before Donald Trump ever used that language. And we got to remember, this was the same Greg Abbott that when Donald Trump was running for office and asked, should the president, and at that time a candidate, disavow the support of the KKK and David Duke, Governor Abbott dodged that question as well, and we're seeing the same kind of response now.
He talked a lot about roundtables, the roundtables that happened after the Santa Fe school shootings. He said that that would be a model for the type of roundtables that we could have out of the El Paso shooting. What do you think about how those previous roundtables went and what needs to perhaps improve for this next round of them?
Well, I think the previous roundtables worked great. We passed 20 measures to improve safety in the state. First, you've got to identify it, then you've got to listen to the different stakeholders. I was really impressed with the governor's call to end the hate. The hate is the beginning of all the problems. And you see some people in this conversation, they're looking for solutions. They're trying to figure a measured approach, trying to figure the best approach for all of Texas.
Doesn't seem like he has a desire to have a special session to bring lawmakers back for conversation about this to possibly get some legislation going right now. What do you think about that? Should there be a special session?
You know, it actually takes a while to draft legislation. It doesn't just happen overnight. So I think the process he's laid out, where you identify the problem, you listen to the stakeholders, you come up with the solutions, and then you figure out a plan to execute those and carry those through. And I think that's the right plan, and I think we need a good measured approach, and we need to listen to all the different stakeholders and get the job done.
Full perspective on the governor's town hall, we bring in our panel. We have Sherry Greenberg, a former Democratic state representative from Austin. She's now a professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. Larry Gonzalez, he's a Republican from Round Rock who served 4 terms in the Texas House where he chaired the Sunset Advisory Commission. He now works as a consultant. And over here we have Matthew Watkins. He's the politics editor for the Texas Tribune. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you. We're happy to be here.
So the El Paso shooting, it looms even over the town hall tonight.
Yes.
What's your take on what he had to say?
Well, something that struck me is that there were a couple of questions that the governor responded to but didn't answer. And one of those was when he was asked about President Trump's tone and what he felt about that and how that related to El Paso and gun violence. And he really didn't address that question. He talked about the reduction in unemployment in the African-American community under President Trump. However, we know that presidents really have very little to do with the economy, whether it's going well or not. And he did not address President Trump's tone. So that really that stuck out to me in that whole discussion.
The governor has been asked to address red flag laws in the past. He has shied away from that in the past, but now it's coming back up. What do you think about what he had to say tonight?
He did not seem particularly enthusiastic about the idea. You know, one of the things he pointed out was that he did not believe that the red flag laws would have prevented this particular shooting in El Paso. I believe his words were this shooter did not display the red flags that would have been necessary to take away a gun. You know, we saw this come up in 2019, in this year's session, and it didn't go anywhere. And I didn't really see anything tonight that would suggest that there's going to be a great big push from the governor to try again.
What about his border security plan? Anything stick out there with you?
You know, it's interesting, man. Sitting on appropriations and being a budget conferee, you really dive into the priorities of what you're spending on. He mentioned $800 million this session. I think I did $800 million in 17, $800 million in 15 as well, right? And we talk about the federal government's not doing their job, and he reiterated that as well. But that's also very true. I mean, we are having to pay because the federal government isn't stepping up. So I agree with what he's saying. Josh, it's complicated and it's troublesome. I-35 splits my hometown, Round Rock, Texas, splits it in half. And I would go to DPS and I would say, show me what we're dealing with. And DPS will show you the numbers. They will show you the weapons, the human trafficking, the drugs. All the data's there for us. And so if someone like me, when I-35 is the corridor to Dallas, once it gets to Dallas, all points across the country, right? That's a true issue. The congressman brings up the other side of the issue, which is, but that's not everybody. I get that. I get that. But for where I live and for what we're dealing with along I-35, it's very real, and the numbers are staggering with what we're looking at coming across our border.
The governor was also asked about the controversial meeting between House Speaker Dennis Bonnen and Empower Texans Michael Quinn Sullivan. Monday, the House General Investigating Committee asked the Texas Rangers to investigate whether any laws were broken. Here's what Abbott said when he was asked if he thinks Bonnen should resign.
What is taking place right now is the best thing that could happen, and that is getting the Texas Rangers involved. They are highly regarded, respected. They are the elite investigating agency here in the state of Texas. We need to get to the bottom of this and get to the bottom of it quickly. If they find out that anything bad happened, action needs to be taken. On the other hand, if after their investigation they say nothing bad or illegal happened, we need to move on.
Well, there you go. What do you think about his response? I didn't think it was too clear exactly. I mean, there wasn't anything definite.
Sure, you know, expressing concern, which is interesting in its own right. You know, it is a sign that there's something happening here. We need to get to the bottom of this. That's an interesting fact. You know, going back to the conversation we were just having about the politics of this, it's not a great time to be having this kind of internal fight in the House. You know, one of the big places where these local issues are coming up is in the Texas House, and I think if you ask the Democrats in this room right now, you know, I think they would say they have sights on flipping that House, and all this drama does not help in the election time, getting organized, preparing for a hugely influential 2020 election.
So many people have talked about how this legislative session, it was kind of a kumbaya between all the top three leaders, you know.
Right.
Sure.
I mean, what is probably going through Governor Abbott's head at this point, because this is someone that he felt clearly allied with.
Well, certainly it was a kumbaya session. Just because you have leaders who are of the same political party, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, doesn't mean they will get along. And if you compare this session to the prior, it was much different. You saw from the very beginning, way before session started, with press releases and press conferences, alignment on the issues. You saw also a return to those bread and butter issues and turning away from the social issues that had been so combative in the prior session. So, you know, the governor showed concern. He is a lawyer. He talked about the legal process. We'll see what happens.
Your thoughts on that?
It's exactly what we talked about in the pre-show. Let it play out. I mean, the House committee did its job. The Rangers are doing their job. If there's something there ethically or legally to deal with, then deal with it. If there's not, then there's not. But I think until that process plays out, I think the governor was exactly right. Just, you know, deep breath and let it work. And then we'll deal with what we deal with when the Rangers are done with their job.
And then if if there's no wrongdoing found, he said, then we'll just move past it.
Sure. I mean, I think there's no question that Governor Abbott and Speaker Bonin worked well together this session. I think Abbott, they see each other as allies. I'm sure he doesn't enjoy seeing this controversy embroil, but ultimately, you know, as he said, we need to get to the bottom of this, and we'll see how it plays out.
And ultimately, it'll be for the members of the Texas House of Representatives to determine. They elect the Speaker.
Yep.
That's right.
All right. Well, thank you all for being with us. Thanks to everyone who was part of this town hall event tonight, the pre-show, the post-show. Had a great time talking with you guys.
Appreciate it, Josh, very much.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you at home for joining us for this special edition of State of Texas. I'm Josh Hinkle. We'll be back Sunday to bring you an in-depth look at Texas politics.